Thank you for joining us today. Let's get started with our webinar. Anin Bojo, Carrie-Anne Charles, Anin Bojo, Minogija, Carrie-Anne Charles, Dishonesty, Ashunyang, Dunjiba, Mayengan, Dodam, Anishinaabe, and Dow, beamed again. Hello, good morning. I'm Carrie-Anne, and I'm from Georgina Island First Nation. I'm of the Wolf Clan, and I'm a proud Anishinaabe woman. Welcome. I am first and foremost a proud First Nation woman, but I am also the Environment Partnership Coordinator for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services, or as we would like to call ourselves, SIPS, and a member of the Latornell Symposium Steering Committee. I am here with you today speaking from my traditional territory of the Williams Treaties First Nations, and on behalf of the Latornell Committee, Conservation Ontario, and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you all to our fourth webinar in the Conservation Matters series of webinars, Indigenous, Protected, and Conserved Areas. What does that mean, and what could that look like? A few housekeeping notes for you this morning. First, all of our attendees are muted and will not be able to speak or come on video. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question, please type it in the box and press enter to have it posted. If you could please include which panelist you would like to address your question, that would help as well. You can also upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up. You will be reviewing the questions, and we will have time to pose a few of them to our panelists at the end of the presentations. Feel free to interact with each other in the webinar through the chat box. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you're not speaking, and of course to unmute yourself when you are. This webinar is being recorded so that members or others who are not able to attend will be able to listen in on their leisure. As the recognition of Indigenous knowledge and perspectives in environmental conservation continues to increasingly grow and be meaningfully pursued to help inform decision-making for the benefit of all beings, I was recruited to this committee in 2017 to assist in ensuring Indigenous inclusion and participation within the Latornell Symposium. I am super excited and honored today to moderate this session. Being a First Nations woman working in the environment field, I see firsthand all of the work that needs to be undertaken to assist Akikwe, Mother Earth, to begin a healing process that had been caused by years of disrespect and mistreatment. Clear cutting of trees, mining of her minerals, and pollution of her waterways, which are the lifeline for all of us, are having a detrimental effect, and we are now at a tipping point where we all must come together to assist her on her path to healing. Another factor that is increasingly being realized and correlated to the decline in her health is the attempted colonization and assimilation of the Indigenous peoples around the world. Gifted with an intimate connection to her and the knowledge to live in harmony with her, the Indigenous peoples have for hundreds of years been suppressed in sharing of our knowledge and upholding of the responsibility bestowed upon us to protect and conserve those that cannot speak for themselves and who provide us with all that is needed to achieve a good life, or minimabadzwin, as we Anishinaabe call it. The deliberate inclusion of Indigenous people's perspectives and knowledge are integral to the decisions being made that will ensure that not only do we all have a healthy environment to live in, but so will our next 7 generations. Today, I am privileged to introduce you to 3 amazing guests that will share with us the history of Indigenous protected and conserved areas movement within Canada, experience in regards to the development of IPCAs in Ontario, as well as other Indigenous governance structures developing Ontario that will not only lead to a healthy, vibrant Mother Earth, but also play a role in reconciliation. Let's introduce you to our first speaker. Please welcome Danika Billy Littlechild. Danika is a Cree from Ermine Skin Cree Nation in Misquicks Treaty No. 6 territory in Alberta. Danika is an assistant professor at Carleton University in the Department of Law and Legal Studies, Faculty of Public Affairs. She teaches courses on environmental and social justice, as well as Indigenous relations, ethics, and law. Danika has focused much of her efforts over the course of her working life on issues related to environment, water, climate change, sustainability, conservation and biodiversity, and served as the co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts under Canada's Pathway Target 1 initiative. She is excited to work with the Conservation Through Reconciliation Project as a lead for the research stream on ethical space. Danika facilitated the first year of the inaugural Indigenous Advisory Circle for Banff National Park and has co-authored 2 peer-reviewed and 1 technical publication relating to conservation, biodiversity, Indigenous peoples, and ethical space. She is also the proud mother of an adventurous 4-year-old. Welcome, Danika. Over to you.
Hi, tansa toya kakeo kinanaskom tinawao otapin tumiek. I'm very honored to be invited to present today at this webinar and to be with all of you in the circle that we've convened together to share information about IPCAs and to share some ideas about where we can go with this concept. So I will just give you a little bit in my presentation around the background and history of IPCAs. And it actually begins internationally because the whole concept of IPCA was not something that was coined within Canada by any means. It's something that really developed internationally and in Canada under different names. So internationally, they're really known as ICCAs as an abbreviation, but they are essentially any territories or areas that are conserved by Indigenous peoples, and they have a lot of different names. So in Canada, they really began as what are called tribal parks. So there was a tribal park, for example, on Vancouver Island in Tlaoquia Nation. There was a tribal park established as a result of a major court decision in 2014 that recognized Aboriginal title for the first time at the Supreme Court in the Chilcotin decision. And the Chilcotin then established a tribal park as a result of that decision around their title. In other parts of the world, and for example, in Latin America, which is the one I'm most familiar with, they are called territorios de vida, territorios de buen vivir, community conserved areas. They're also called sacred areas. They're locally managed marine areas. There are many, many terms for these protected areas by Indigenous peoples. And it's really about elevating the diversity of Indigenous peoples globally. And the abbreviation of ICCA is really just for general discussion or communication. So ICCAs definitely predated IPCAs here in Canada. They've been around and have been quite well recognized internationally for well over a decade. And certainly in the context of, for example, the IUCN, ICCAs, and the ICCA Consortium, which is a non-governmental organization that sort of coordinates a network of ICCAs around the world, has a very prominent role internationally in understanding how we approach stewardship and management of protected and conserved areas in the context of decolonization and recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights and responsibilities. Right now, a major idea at the UN, which is steadily being implemented in the context of multilateral environmental agreements like the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties in Glasgow that just concluded, a one with nature approach or nature-based solutions approach, which attempts to encompass this concept of ICCAs and understands the contribution that Indigenous conserved areas can make to combating climate change, to dealing with biodiversity loss, et cetera. But I think for Indigenous peoples, ICCAs internationally have represented the possibility of continuation of Indigenous tenure, of revival of Indigenous territories, modification of traditional practices, new initiatives like ecosystem restoration. I think we are actually on the cusp, I believe, or have already started the International Decade on Ecosystem Restoration at the United Nations. And so I would imagine that ICCAs internationally will play a role in that. ICCAs have also been described as sort of an innovative use of resources and territories in the face of different threats, i.e. development, or opportunities. And I think you're going to hear about some of those today from the other speakers. According to the ICCA consortium, the global coverage of ICCAs is estimated to be about 13% of the terrestrial surface of the planet. So that's an interesting statistic that I wanted to include. One of the more commonly heard statistics is that, Indigenous peoples steward over 80% of the world's biodiversity. And certainly, I think that sounds fairly accurate. And in fact, the UN, in their recent report on the Human Development Index, said that one individual Indigenous person in the Amazon sort of conducting and living their life ways in their traditional ways is offsetting the greenhouse gas emissions of a person in the global north, i.e. Canada. And so the need for continued protection and conservation of Indigenous territories in accordance with their own methodologies and in their own approaches cannot be understated in the context of the rather frightening things that we heard come out of the COP in Glasgow around what is happening with climate change. And of course, our hearts go out to those in British Columbia right now, who many of whom were experiencing firsthand those results of extraordinary deforestation in that province, and what they are now experiencing in terms of flooding and landslides. And this after also a season of wildfires, one of which destroyed an entire town in one day, the town of Lytton. And so we know that, that some of these global environmental crises that we all collectively face in Mother Earth, are real. They are happening now, and I think the concept of Indigenous protected and conserved areas is quite relevant to the whole dialogue that we need to have. So in order to talk about the development of IPCAs in Canada, I need to tell you a little bit about where that designation came from and how it was developed under what is called the Pathway to Canada Target 1. So essentially what happened was way back in 2010, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, of which Canada is a member and a party, a strategic plan for biodiversity was adopted at the what is called the CBD, Convention for Biological Diversity, Conference of the Parties. So the Conference of the Parties term just means all the states who are signatories or ratified a legally binding international convention, they all come together for a meeting about that convention and how to implement it. So when they talk about the UNFCCC COP, it means all the parties who have signed on to the UNFCCC on climate change, or the CBD COP means all those parties who have signed on to and ratified the CBD. And so Canada is one of them. So in 2010, there was a COP for the CBD in Aishi, Japan. And at that COP, they developed a strategic plan to try to start addressing the biodiversity crisis internationally. And what they developed were called the Aishi Targets. They always name these documents after the place in which they have the meeting. So these targets were called, the strategic plan was called the Aishi Targets. And they had 20 global biodiversity targets, with the idea that every state party would achieve these targets by the year 2020. So it wasn't until the Trudeau government was elected in 2015 that Canada actually began to implement its obligations under these targets. So once Trudeau was elected, he began the work of convening his government and getting them moving on trying to do what they could within 5 years from 2015 to 2020 of addressing the biodiversity targets set under Aishi Targets. And so Canada decided to adopt a suite of national targets known as the 2020 Biodiversity Goals and Targets for Canada. There were 4 goals and 19 targets covering everything from species at risk to sustainable forestry. And what happened under the Pathway to Canada Target 1 was they decided to take Aishi Target 11 and make it Canada's Target 1. So they made this idea of protecting around 17.5% of all terrestrial and inland waters by 2020 as Canada's #1 target. So they said, we're just going to do our best to try to get to that number by 2020. Unfortunately, Canada didn't reach that number. When we began this journey in 2015 under the Trudeau government, there was, I think, 10.13% was protected in Canada at that time. And that encompassed sort of national and provincial parks and other kinds of protected areas. And so what they decided to do in 2015 was to create sort of a new infrastructure under this initiative to help advise the federal government and provincial and territorial governments about how to get to 17.5% protection by 2020. And one of the bodies that they convened was the Indigenous Circle of Experts. So they said, okay, we're going to convene a committee of individuals who are recognized as experts in the field of biodiversity and conservation. Not just Indigenous peoples, but also representatives of provincial and territorial governments. So about half the committee was Indigenous, half was representatives of provincial and territorial governments. And so the ICE had about a year in which to work and to produce an outcome document. So this is actually a photo of the members of the ICE who were Indigenous, what we called the ICE Corps, who led the work of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. And you can see me there with my son at the time, who was just an infant, along with Eli Enns, who was also my co-chair, standing to my left in the photo, with whom I co-chaired the Indigenous Circle of Experts. And so within the year that we were convened and had to work, we had to produce a set of sort of guidance for the co-lead governments under the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative. And what we produced in 2018 is a report called We Rise Together, Achieving Pathway to Canada Target 1 through the creation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas in the spirit and practice of reconciliation. And so you can see here the cover art for our report, which should also be made available in the chat for you to link to. And in the context of this report, we had provided 28 recommendations and introduced the designation of IPCA to the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative, as well as to the co-lead governments under the Pathway initiative. And that concept of IPCA was something that we very much took from the international community. At that time, my co-chair Eli Enns had done a lot of work with IUCN and also with the ICCA consortium, and Eli had also worked on tribal parks in Canada, including one in his own nation of Gloquiat. And so, the IPCA designation was sort of born in the context of Canada through the We Rise Together report and some of the affiliated reports of the National Advisory Panel and the National Steering Committee under the Pathway Initiative. And you can look at that website and explore, you know, who was all involved in Pathway and the chronology of things. But the ICE report is really where we hunkered down and did some heavy lifting on what IPCAs would mean in the Canadian context. But before I start talking about IPCAs, I want to quickly say that in the context of the We Rise Together report, part of what was interesting about that work was that we were basically given the space as a committee to write what we actually thought. In other words, nobody came in to veto any aspect of what we produced. It was not edited in any way. It was not, there was nothing that was redacted. This is all, everything that is in the We Rise Together report comes from the Indigenous Circle of Experts. And if you read the report, you know, Eli and I reflect in the introduction and in the conclusion about what it was like to do this work as a committee. And part of what I think was really magical about this moment that brought these folks together was that you had a government that was very willing to make appropriate space for Indigenous-led conversations about protected areas and conservation in Canada. And so our report does not shy away from talking about the dark histories of Canada. And our report is actually looking at, for example, the standards set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which, by the way, are minimum standards. They're the floor, not the ceiling. They're not aspirational. They are to be the minimum standards achieved by Indigenous peoples in accordance with an operative article in the UN Declaration that actually says it's the minimum standards. So ICE took that. And then also, we had the benefit of doing our work, you know, in a moment when the TRC final report had just been issued as well. And so we were able to look at those calls to action and think deeply about what reconciliation might mean in the context of conservation and protected areas. And so I think for me, one of the major pillars of our report is that we actually say what has to happen is the elevation of Indigenous systems, of Indigenous rights and responsibilities, recognizing Indigenous peoples as the experts, as the people who know in accordance with their own knowledge systems. And we don't spend a lot of time, for example, talking about like traditional ecological knowledge or things that might represent sort of taking information from Indigenous systems and applying them under the established dominant frameworks around conservation and protected areas. Instead, we're saying those established frameworks must now make the space for Indigenous systems to be fully implemented and realized and led by Indigenous peoples. And I think that there's really a broadening support in the conservation movement, as well as in different levels of government, to embracing sort of the decolonization of conservation, to behaving in a way that honors the spirit and practice of reconciliation, and in a way that actually does elevate rights of Indigenous peoples. And so I've already reviewed that, so I won't go into that. So let's get into IPCAs. So essentially, we define them in the report as lands and waters where Indigenous peoples lead in protecting and conserving cultures and ecosystems through our laws, our governance, our knowledge systems. You know, of course, culture and language are at the heart of everything, and IPCAs are also considered to be sort of part of the larger ICCA family. So there is really sort of no hard and fast definition of IPCAs in the sense that we say we're very, we tried not to be prescriptive about it. We didn't want to create a definition that was hard to fit into. We wanted to be expansive. And so in the report, we talk about elements that we see being present in IPCAs, but it's sort of like this approach, like including but not limited to, or may include the following, as opposed to this is what an IPCA is. So in our report, we talk about these elements. We say, look, this is, IPCAs are Indigenous led. And so this doesn't mean sort of, you know, non-Indigenous peoples taking the reins and making Indigenous peoples partners in that. That's a partnership, but Indigenous-led means actually led by Indigenous peoples. They have the primary role in determining the objectives, the boundaries, the management plans, governance structures, as an aspect of self-determination, which is a very fundamental right that exists under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which, by the way, has also been adopted by the Canadian government under federal legislation. And so you can look up that act to see that the federal government has indeed adopted the UN Dec as Canadian law. So self-determination features dominantly in the UN Declaration and therefore is something that is now part of Canadian law. IPCAs have a long-term commitment, to conservation for future generations. And one of the things that emerged really strongly in our deliberations as the Indigenous Circle of Experts was to highlight not just rights of Indigenous peoples, which there's really like a whole galaxy of Indigenous rights. There's internationally established minimum standards under the UN Declaration and Indigenous rights that have emerged in other international frameworks. There's also the rights that have been described under Canadian common law or Canadian civil law in Quebec. And those also are very important. Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution includes Aboriginal and treaty rights. But we're also talking about, rights within the context of Indigenous legal orders themselves, as well as for Indigenous peoples, the sort of flip side of rights are responsibilities. And we spent a lot of time thinking very deeply about what Indigenous responsibilities meant when realized in the context of IPCAs, and how we could see the way to protect the exercise of those responsibilities. So part of what we envision around IPCAs, or what we did envision, were that there would be new sort of governance opportunities. So we already know that there's lots of examples of like co-management, et cetera. There are some great initiatives that have happened for sure that have created partnerships between Indigenous peoples and other Canadians. But we wanted to sort of encourage innovation and transformation in the context of IPCAs. And so there's lots of different ways that these things could be structured. And so as you can see on your screen, there's lots of different examples of how that could happen. Cooperative management, the potential when an IPCA overlaps with provincial or territorial crown lands, where there is, maybe benefit agreements that exist pertaining to IPCAs. There might be more partners than just federal, provincial governments and Indigenous peoples. There could be municipalities who are involved. There could be people who are already governing protected areas, say like a biosphere area in Canada that is a designation provided by UNESCO. So there's so many different ways that we can think about IPCA governance. And so we wanted to include some ideas around models for IPCA partnerships, just to give people guidance, but not to be prescriptive. So in other words, what we described in the report is not intended to be like the be all end all on IPCAs. It's just intended to be a starting point, really, and to give folks who are reading that and taking that into a policy place or space, that they could bring these ideas forward. And so you can see that we thought about, having Indigenous government partnerships, Indigenous non-government partnerships, which I think you'll be hearing about, hybrid partnerships, and sole Indigenous governance. And we are seeing some of that emerge. One thing that I will say is that even though since the release of the We Rise Together report, we have seen somewhat of a proliferation of IPCAs, one of the things that I'll say, for example, with Littlechild, is that predated the work of the Indigenous Circle of Experts by about like 8 years. So that was under negotiation, I think, for about 10 years total, is my understanding. So these things may not happen super quickly. Like maybe the perception was that Let's Okay came out of the We Rise Together report. Not at all. That was in negotiation for many, many years. And I think the We Rise Together report provided a little bit of a catalyst and some momentum to that work for sure, and contributed perhaps to the final negotiations. But certainly Let's Okay, for example, is one of those that for sure predates the We Rise Together report. So when we completed this work in 2018 and had gone through this sort of very intensive year of engaging with Indigenous peoples across Canada, we engaged with ceremony as much as we did with written words and terms of reference and that kind of thing. When we finished our report, we actually delivered that report in ceremony to the lead governments. And you can see there in the photo on the far left of your screen, former Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, Catherine McKenna. They're receiving the report in ceremony that was led by Elders Larry McDermott and Elders Reg and Rose Crowshoe, and myself with my co-chair Eli Enns, basically surrounded by the members of our Indigenous Circle of Experts, which as I mentioned, it was Indigenous and non-Indigenous, providing our report, providing our recommendations, and handing over the responsibilities of carrying this forward to those co-lead governments in ceremony. And so this was really fundamentally for me, representative of what it really means to elevate Indigenous systems, to make them real and alive to the processes and the engagements that we have across our societies and amongst all of our diversity as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And so I hope that this has sort of helped you to understand a little bit about where IPCAs have come from, how we chose to approach the development of them in the context of the work of the We Rise Together. It is definitely going places. There has been a renewed commitment from this Trudeau government to protected and conserved areas, with the idea that by 2025 we will have, achieved 25% protection, and by 2030 we will achieve 30%. And hopefully IPCAs are a part of that. Thank you very much.
Miigwech, Danika. That was such a great foundation for our audience, for our next two speakers. So let's introduce you to our second speaker. Please welcome Chris Birch. Chris works for Shawanaga First Nation as the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area Coordinator. Before his journey started at Shawanaga, he graduated from the Natural Environment Technologist Conservation and Management Program at Sault College of Applied Arts and Technology. After graduation from Sault College, he took on multiple short-term contracts with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry as a fisheries technician. Beamed again, Chris. Floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. I just want to start out by saying thank you for the invitation to make this presentation today, and for everybody who's able to join us. Yeah, Shawanaga First Nation is a recipient of Target 1 Challenge funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada to establish an Indigenous protected and conserved area on Shawanaga Island. The funding is for 4 years, and as of this upcoming April, we will have completed 3 years of the project. In this presentation, I'll talk about why Shawanaga decided to establish an IPCA and what we've done so far, as well as maybe some take-home messages. Shawanaga First Nation is leading the project. We are getting support from a Guelph-based consulting firm, Shared Value Solutions. There are also several other local conservation groups that are also partners on the project in a working group. They are Georgian Bay Biosphere, Georgian Bay Forever, Township of Archipelago, and Point of Barrow Islanders Association. So some of the things we will cover is a little bit about Shawanaga First Nation, Shawanaga Island Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, our goals, and some of the project activities that have been completed thus far. So this here is a quote from Shawanaga First Nation Ojibwe territory, as stated in the Shawanaga First Nation Constitution. As we have in the past, so do we now, and must continue into the future to exercise these rights and fulfill the responsibilities and obligations for the land upon which we were placed, for our Aboriginal rights, and for this Anishinaabe way of life. So in pre-contact times, Anishinaabe in this region range from the Saguenay River to the south, the Magnetawan River to the north, west to Georgian Bay, including the 30,000 islands, and east to the Ottawa Valley. It's also part of the Robinson Huron signatory. So Shawanaga's reserved lands, surveyed reserved lands, are in 3 parcels. Shawanaga Reserve number 17 is where most on-reserve members live. Shawanaga has approximately 600 members, with about 210 living on Shawanaga surveyed reserved lands. Shawanaga Reserve number 17B is what is referred to as the landing, which is on the coastline of Georgian Bay, and where members launch boats to travel to and from the island, and as well as Shawanaga River. Naskutang Reserves number 17A. The north is the northmost part or parcel. The Harris River and Naskut River converge and pass through this land. So this here is just kind of showing roughly where Shawanaga Island is in comparison to where the landing is, and Shawanaga Reserve parceled lands. Shawanaga is located on the eastern side of Georgian Bay, north of Parry Sound. Shawanaga Island consists of about 1,020 hectares of treaty land, plus inland waters, coastline, and near shore waters. So Shawanaga Island is located within the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve, an area designated by the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, otherwise known as UNESCO, in 2006. It is an area of 347,000 hectares that stretches 200 kilometers along the eastern coast from Port Severn to the French River, in the world's largest freshwater archipelago, also known as the 30,000 Islands. Shawanaga Island has been a candidate conservation reserve since the early 2000s. There's an old growth white pine forest on the island that is unique because of the history of logging in the area. Some baseline studies were done in the early 2000s to characterize the landforms, plants, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish of eastern Georgian Bay. So this is a definition of an IPCA summarized from the We Rise Together report by the Indigenous Circle of Experts. IPCAs are lands and waters where Indigenous governments have the primary role of protecting and conserving through Indigenous laws, knowledge systems, and cultural learnings. So the Target 1 challenge was put into place in order to protect 17% of terrestrial areas and inland waters by 2020 and to establish new IPCAs. For decades, Shawanaga members have not been using Shawanaga Island the way their parents and ancestors had. This is for many reasons, including barriers to access and tension with other land users. Thinking about like what motivated Shawanaga to establish an IPCA, creating an IPCA can help Shawanaga remove those barriers. Members can reconnect with the land and with the island, steward the lands and waters guided by Anishinaabe values, and build understanding of Anishinaabe knowledge systems, culture, and language among Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So our vision for the island and our goals, protect and conserve Shawanagan's cultural and traditional practices and language, to support Shawanagan members to continue using and have greater access to the island, protect and conserve and restore biodiversity and ecosystems on the island, protect and conserve culturally significant areas, establish food security and sovereignty, establish own source revenue, so the Shawanagan Island IPCA is economically sustainable. In that case, that could mean something like an ecotourism project that could bring some kind of revenue into the community in order to fund the IPCA moving forward, and foster cross-cultural exchange and learning opportunities. So creating an IPCA is also a community-led process. We want our community's laws, knowledge, culture, and language to be at the heart of the creation of the Shawanagan Island IPCA. And we prioritize engaging our members and leadership to set the path for the project. So some of the things that have taken place since the project's started. So we've conducted traditional knowledge studies in the beginning of the project, held an opening ceremony, conducted knowledge holder and youth interviews, community workshops, staff workshops. We've sent out multiple surveys to kind of gauge what the community wants with regards to access, or what they want preserved on the island, what areas, I guess, mean the most to community. So removing barriers for members to reconnect with the island is important. So some of the ways we've done this is through some capital purchases. We've purchased a boat that can be used to bring community to and from the island for ceremony. We've purchased and installed docks around the island for anybody to park, so that they're not really wrecking the shoreline, and increased awareness of the project among members. We've also been working like diligently on strengthening our partnerships with outside organizations. As I mentioned in the beginning, we do have the working group with Georgian Bay Biosphere, Georgian Bay Forever, Township of Archipelago, and Point of Barrel Islanders Association. These are all relationships that are important to build, and so that we can support each other moving forward and really focus on that reconciliation portion of an IPCA. So some of the communication approaches we've taken, we've created a communications plan, held a community logo contest. As you see, this was the logo on the right side. There is the logo that ended up being chosen and designed to represent the Shawanagan Island IPCA. We've created a Facebook account for the IPCA in order to keep members and non-members kind of up to date on project activities, that sort of thing. And we've also launched a website, and the link is below there, ShawanaganIslandIPCA.ca. Feel free to check it out and support us in any way you can. Some of the field work that has been conducted to support the creation of the management plan for the IPCA. We've conducted water sampling out on Georgian Bay and in Shawanaga River, as well as Nayscoot River. These areas were chosen based off of community feedback on important locations to them. So we collected water, sediment, and benthic invertebrate samples. We've also conducted ecological land classification surveys on Shawanaga Island, and we've done a little bit of mapping of potential campsites and trail systems that could potentially support, like I said, an ecotourism style project. So some of the things that are next on our agenda is to develop or finish the development of the management plan. Going along with that, we're going to put out videos about the management plan, create a story map for the website, and conversations with leadership, working group, and community members to get their input on where we are at with regards to the management plan and what they would like changed or they agree or disagree with. We are going to research and apply for additional funding opportunities to help support the IPCA after the 4th year of the project. And we're looking into creating a coloring book about the history of Shawanaga First Nations, hoping to have somebody an artist from the community kind of like design the pictures for the coloring book, and fun little way to keep kids involved and youth involved. And I guess that's it. So miigwech.
Miigwech, Chris. A great presentation to give the audience a glimpse of what an IPCA could look like here in Ontario. Your community is doing a great work, and I look forward to seeing what comes next in your project. So I'm happy to introduce our final speaker. Please welcome Gary Williams. Gary is a member of the Curve Lake First Nation, a pipe carrier, hunter, gatherer, former elected chief, and has served 2 terms on Curve Lake First Nations Council. He is also a businessman and a musician. Bean again, Gary. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Carrie Ann. I'm just looking for my presentation here. Where did it go? Oh, no, that's the wrong one. Dang. Sorry, folks. Here, I'm coming out of retirement here, so I'm a little dated here. Here we go. Oh, there it is. So I go here. Okay. Okay, can you hear me, Carrie Ann?
Sure can, Gary.
Oh, okay. I think I'm getting it reeled in here. Let me just see here. Okay. So everything looks good here. I just hit play and I think I'm good to go. Here we go. That
Looking
working
good.
there?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I see the space holders for the other cameras there, which is going to affect my reading of the font. So I'm just wondering how I can get rid of that. Maybe Mario can help me out there. Anyways, I'll start here. I know we were all pressed for time, and I just want to thank you guys for inviting me here. I've kind of been in retirement as far as my political and I guess my stating of my opinions of how things roll or have you know, our history and stuff. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak my truth today. So anyways, I'm just going to go in here with the slide. Let me see here. Okay, I'll do my introductions here formally. Gary Williams is my name, my English name. I've yet to get my Anishinaabe name. So I'm working on that and getting kind of close. I'm just trying to figure out how I can go about that. I know how to go about that in a traditional sense, but I wanted to work on that in other ways. Anyways, I'm 61 years old. I grew up in Curve Lake First Nations. My dad was a hunter and fisherman until I went to school, until my sisters and I went to school in Lakefield. And then he realized that that way of living wasn't going to cut it as far as us fitting in with kind kind of Western society. So he at that point switched to doing construction work and starting his own business. But anyways, but I did have, I was lucky enough to go with him, out with him and some of his, well, a lot of his spring and fall trapping, when he went trapping. And I remember sitting at the front of the canoe with the wave blowing over the canoe. I was getting wet, I'd be cold, but I knew enough. I knew that I couldn't complain because I was happy being with him and happy learning the ways, but it was, there was times where it wasn't comfortable and it wasn't easy. So I also went hunting, fishing, hunting beaver, fox, coyote. You know, these times gave me a strong connection to the land and our traditional way of life. He didn't speak a lot of Anishinaabe to me when we were out there. It was mostly English, and I mean, it's pretty documented why that didn't happen. You know, but it did teach me, you know, respect for the elements, perseverance, and many other things as well. So I'm appreciative of that. Let's see what else we got. Anything else here? Oh yeah, I also remember getting our first TV here at Curve Lake. I remember getting our first telephone. I remember getting running water in the house and indoor toilet. All of these conveniences that we so take for granted today. I also remember the road getting paved into Curve Lake. Up until that point, it was kind of like a double lane path where cars could travel. And I also remember too when it was a single lane path coming into the village. So I guess my point is that I've had the experience and I guess the lessons of a lot of change and learned to be adaptable. But through that, I also learned to be observant of kind of why these changes were happening and you know, to try to make the best of every situation. So those are some, that's who I am. So I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I've got my turtle shaker, and so I'm going to start off with a song, and I want to tell you a little bit about this song. You'll have to excuse me with my presentation stuff. I'm a little rusty. Anyway, the shaker was the first sound to be heard when creation began. So I'm going to sing you a little song here. Okay, so here we go on 3. Oh, hey, yeah. Okay, now that was one of the first songs that I learned when I was just beginning to learn about my culture and history. That was about, minimum 30 years ago. And 3 years ago, I was at a conference in Winnipeg, and the host drum opened the conference with this song. So I immediately thought of how much land our people occupied and how connected we were. And that connection wasn't inhibited by distance. And it just it really kind of hit me as to I used to know the size and the vastness of our people and those songs and those traditions and how they maintained how they're still here. Okay, and in those songs too, like I mean, just a note of how deep, I guess, we were. We use vocables in those songs because of the variety of dialects across Turtle Island. and the distinct languages that were there as well. So this way, using the vocables, these songs could be easily learned and at social gatherings between nations. So I've got a picture, and to kind of elude copyright issues, I pulled up a picture of a map of North America. And I traced out that map of North America. And as you can see, it looks like a turtle. Hence the name Turtle Island. So this is my understanding. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell you a really condensed creation story. And then, okay, so anyways, after the Great Flood, Nana-Bijou was floating around on a log. And there was other animals swimming around beside him and with him. And at times, other animals would take turns getting on that log for a rest. So some time passed, and Nana-Bijou, it came to Nana-Bijou that he could recreate the land with the help of the Creator. So he asked the animals if one of them wanted to volunteer to go down to get some earth at the bottom of the water. And I think it was a loon was the first one to volunteer. He said, "I live in the water. I want to try." So they said, "Okay." So he went down, and he was gone a really, really long time. And then he came up gasping for air. And it took him a couple of minutes before he could actually talk and tell them that the water was really deep. He couldn't get down, so he couldn't get any mud, dirt, land. So other animals tried, and I'm just going to condense the story. Other animals tried, and they just couldn't do it, and many came very close to not making it back up. And then near the end, there was a soft voice in the back came up and it said, "I'll try." And it was a little Wajashk, the muskrat, was going to try to go down. And then there was kind of a little bit of maybe a couple of snickers and stuff, but Nana-Bijou said, "Yeah, you can go ahead and you can try." So he went down, and he was gone a really, really long time. And they waited, and they thought, they didn't think things were going to be good for how long he was gone. And then all of a sudden, the Josh came up, and he had passed. He'd sacrificed himself to go down and get the land. So they opened his paw, and in his paw was some land so that he could do his part to help recreate the earth. So Nana-Bijou placed his that dirt on the turtle's back. So, and then from that, with the help of the Creator, the earth kept expanding and expanding and expanding into Turtle Island. And this is what you see here. And it's kind of I don't know what it is. It's not by choice that this picture of North America doesn't have any boundaries on it. And it's not that we didn't recognize land ownership. It's just that we recognized that it was for all of our people. And there was times where we made dispute boundaries, but that's pretty interesting. So I believe it's no mistake that we call this place Turtle Island. We were spiritual people with very powerful medicine. We connected through creation, through ceremony, respect, and observation. And our ceremonies were powerful. My dad and other medicine people told me stories of our medicine people traveling through time and space. And yeah, I get into the details of those stories, but I don't think this is the place to do it. But yeah, I know that these guys knew their stuff because they'd spent the time out there doing the stuff they need to do to have these stories come to them. Okay, so I'm going to focus today on I'm here to talk about on behalf of the Land Between and the First Nation, the traditional land trust here that we're trying to form. But I'm going to talk more about the why, not so much the how, and important why it's important to focus on the why. So, as I've already said, I'm doing the presentation, and fortunately or unfortunately, it's mostly my perspective. But you know, thinking today, I was talking to my mother this morning, and she's getting older, and I asked her how you say truth, and I asked her how to say who speaks the truth, and it's so the best we could come up with it, because she's kind of forgetful, is Dekanan Deblawen, which is I know my truth. And I hope it's presented in a manner that has some order and makes sense. That's why we've taken this approach. And there are in the future, there'll also be other needs that will have to be addressed. And this presentation may have parts that may be interpreted as something else other than my good intended truth. It's my journey that has led me to this, to feel that this is important. But my truth is only based on what I know today and this time and this place. And I can't see what this last one is because the cameras are in the way, and I don't think I can move it. But so I've been I've been a member of the Land Between for about 15 years, and through that time we've done a lot of good work as far as environmental protection, but we saw the need to kind of expand on that. So this is how the Land Trust came to be conceptualized. So this is my political experience, chief and council experience. I'm going to pick up the pace here. Just I'm not really timing myself here. I was elected chief of Curve Lake in 1996. I'm sorry, in 1995. And then RCAP had come out in 1996. It was completed. There was 5 volumes, 4,000 pages, and 440 recommendations. So needless to say, I had quite a bit of reading to do, and that was just one of the things that I had to read, because I had just started to get into my culture, and then I wanted to help the community by things that I had learned to that point. So there was a lot of reading, and my point is I was pretty green. RCAP was initiated largely because of the Oka crisis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little later on. We were also involved in a self-government process with the United Anishinaabe Councils. Again, most of the practices and protocols were not included at this time in these agreements because our traditional teachings had just started to be revived at our community. And I'm sure at other communities it was the same. For example, when I was chief, I remember sitting at the council table and we were having discussions as to whether or not to allow a sweat ceremony to happen on Curve Lake property. So we talked about liabilities and other issues, and it was just, it kind of, you know, at that time being just kind of learning about our culture and stuff, I thought, man, this is weird. But anyways, that's just where we were at that time. And it's good to know that we've got a healthy revitalization of our culture going on here. And we've got some great elders, knowledge keepers here, and language keepers as well. Okay, so back then and back into the Williams Treaty negotiations, we're in a time of transition as we were in the process of changing negotiators, as well as we were kind of changing negotiation directions and stuff. So I remember going to I was one of the kind of naive chiefs, new, and so they were setting up these things to go to other communities to talk to the community members and elders as to where we were as far as our direction goes. And I remember taking some pretty serious heat at some of these meetings, but it was a good learning experience because I got to hear what people were feeling in their hearts, and they weren't pulling any punches as to what how they felt things were going. So I remember those things. And the Ipperwash dispute was in full swing. And I've got to say, I was like moved by the extreme action the province took in their attempt to regain control and compliance in that conflict, right? It's a conflict issue. And that's where Dudley George was met his demise at the hands of the governments. Anyways, yeah, so needless to say, there was a lot going on back in the day, but I had a lot of, I was very open to learning and listening to what people said, what the experienced chiefs were saying, and I really remembered a lot of that, and I took that to heart. So, and that stays with me today. So I saw how the feds and the province and we, as an Indian Act First Nation, reacted to those situations and realized how they are all interconnected, and somehow results are formulated by the system. And I know Danika was talking about systems earlier in her presentation, and you know, I think there's those things have to be recognized. You know, that it's some of these things are not personal, but they're more systematic. History. Okay. Prior to contact, we had government, we had our own governance, economies, languages, medicines, ceremonies, and you can check out the RCAP report for those things and you know, to kind of confirm that. And you know, those things aren't recorded in history. Like, I mean, it's funny how things have happened where very few people, or there's a few people that kind of know and experience our history. But we interacted as a part of creation, not better, but as equals. We observed how creation naturally created balance. For instance, we were aware of the seasons and their purpose and how we adjusted our ways of life to live within those seasons. So, and that's just a small part of how we interacted, you know, with those clan systems and stuff, and understanding things. And the clan system was based, and again, I can't see the bottom of my font because the camera space holders are there. The clan system was based on our observations of our animal relatives. We emulated their qualities and traits and used those in our interaction with family, community, neighbors, and other nations. These systems and traits brought balance and equity and the ability to come to fair decisions for our people and those we interacted with. And our history, I mean, the history, that the collective history of Canada, mainstream Canada and Indigenous Canada, a lot of times there is no reference point for, I guess, the beauty or the utopia style way we live with nature and interacted with nature, and that's the part that's kind of forgotten. And since first contact, our system of government and spiritualism was questioned and marginalized by external governments, some religious groups, and some colonizers. So it's over time that has kind of been, we've been kind of brainwashed to believe that our system wasn't a good system. And for mainstream Canada, there is no record, or there is no history of that, of how we lived and how those things worked. So, I mean, so this marginalization in general was just a part of an ugly systematic process that had been developed through trial and error by the British Crown. And its main purpose was to acquire land and resources. And you can also reference the document of discovery, or doctrine of discovery. So yeah, there's certain things that happen in history and the formation of how law was developed and how those laws identified us and kind of restricted our rights through that identification. So check that out. Attempts at self-government. Okay, Anishinaabe Nation, Curve Lake First Nation. I'm going to use these two examples because these are the ones that I know of. Okay, my friend Gordon Wainabunts worked with other elders within the Anishinaabe Nation, the Union of Ontario Indians, to develop information to be included in the development of Anishinaabe Chinookian. And this information included how the clan system worked, the principles, the 7 grandfather teachings, and the chart that kind of shows how that traditional structure worked. It was quite an amazing document, and it was a great concept, and there was a lot of information gathered by a lot of knowledgeable elders within the Anishinaabe Nation. And it was a part, however, it was a part of the Anishinaabe self-government agreement, which included this Chinook Nagawan. And I guess the result was some communities bought in and ratified it, and others didn't. And last year, Curve Lake also had a vote on its Chinook Nagawan. And lots of our people put a lot of time and effort into its development. However, the ratification vote didn't have a huge voter turnout and did not get the votes required to ratify it. So it's my opinion that we subconsciously realize we are living in a system that is not ours, and to try to incorporate our original teachings and system into what is to us a flawed system historically hasn't worked. And I'm going to use a orange and camouflage. Victim or warrior mentality. Okay, September 30th, 2021 was where the federal government declared a federal holiday, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Dishonesty. It was to acknowledge and teach about the multi-generational damage created by residential schools. It was also to remember the now thousands of exhumed children. All were basically kidnapped and abused. Some were used as scientific experiments, sex objects, and some eventually murdered. These barbaric acts were just part of the process to assimilate us and separate us from who we are and what we are. September 26, 1990, that was the end of the Oka crisis. And to remind you all, there was 4,500 troops, Canadian Army troops that were sent there, several hundred Quebec police versus the Kanesatake warriors, and supporters from neighboring reserves and other First Nations across Ontario and Canada. Only one of these was recognized in September of this year by Canada and the media. So I asked a question, and this is my internal question, that is this an intentional effort by the federal government to perpetuate our victimness and distract us from focusing on a warrior spirit? And this is a quote from, I believe, Warrior Chief Minavavana. He was from West Manitoula, and he said this quote at the Royal Proclamation of 1763. "We recognize you have defeated the French, but you have not defeated the Anishinaabe." So what is the warrior spirit? Our warrior spirit is part of who we are. This spirit lives in both men and women. Practices like looking after ourselves, keeping healthy so we can look after our elderly, our communities, and our young are more of the day-to-day responsibilities of the warrior. Having a healthy warrior spirit doesn't mean we want to fight and make war. It could actually mean the opposite. A relatable concept in the martial arts is learn to fight so you don't have to. It's a last resort when all other options have been exhausted. I believe historically this is how we worked. And I can't see my other points here. But we often look for other organizations to be accountable. And at some point, we are going to have to make those people accountable. We can't forever accept apologetic words with no action. We can't accept that forever. So at some point, we're going to have to somehow make our oppressors accountable. And there's another quote from Minavavana. "These woods, lakes, and mountains are our inheritance from our ancestors, and we will part with them to no one." Okay, this is my land between, also Leora Berman and myself conceptualized the idea of a traditional style governance and land trust. So again, I talked earlier, but I've been with the Land Between for about 15 years. And during that time, I considered myself a voice for the Anishinaabe people, animals, and generally the environment within its boundaries. The Traditional Governments Land Trust was presented to Curve Lake Council in 2019, so we could apply to initiate its startup. However, it wasn't successful, but the concept was well received by the funders. One of the main points we stressed was that it be separate from the Indian Act government and other organizations that may dilute the purity of its development and operations. From its conception, it has always been the intent for the land trust, the Land Between, to be the incubator entity to assist in the establishment of the legal requirements of the land trust and to lead in the consultation to develop policies and procedures that will be accommodating to elders and traditional knowledge keepers, so that we'll learn our cultural and spiritual ways again in a space where there is little systematic interference as possible. The Land Between access funding that allowed us to hire staff that could research and identify potential elders and knowledge keepers to guide the process of the reestablishment of clan-based or other traditional style governance structures. Greeting ceremony. I'm going to talk a little about a greeting ceremony, and it was between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. So back in 1996, my friend Dan Longboat, then professor at Trent University, and I then elected chief, organized a greeting ceremony between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe of Curve Lake. At this time, this was one of the most powerful things I'd been a part of. It was an event where ancient protocols were performed and teachings and history were shared between two nations. Fish Turtle Clan. Mediation, justice, and kind of like the why me. When I was first asked about my clan, I was told I was a Gnoja, Pike clan, Muskie clan. But as I go along my journey, I see that my dad and I have strong Turtle Clan traits. I've been told they are of the same group and traits sometimes often intertwined. Fish Clan is mediator, sometimes involved in justice. I found myself living in both the colonizer world and our traditional world and trying to learn and share about our system of living and governance. I'd also like to remind you all that our traditional and spiritual ways are so deep and all-inclusive that I can only speak about what little I know. It will take time to develop that collective knowledge and practices that was once common knowledge to all of our people. Foreign systems, changing systems. To reiterate the fact, before contact, we had our own system of living that was all-encompassing, including resources. One of the main reasons I feel we need the land trust separate from the Indian Act government is because those entities are tied through funding. And for that reason, it has been impossible to this point for traditional governments to gain any traction because of this fact. Having said that, this naturally leads to accessing other creative funding sources for our future operations. Anishinaabe Land Trust, Traditional Land Trust. A 2019 presentation to Council to request support for the Land Trust presentation included that the Land Trust would exist separate from the Indian Act. Funding was accessed to begin the research and development of the Land Trust. Knowledge keepers were asked for input on what would be included in the document. Staff formulated this information and the legal documents required to start a land trust within the existing legal and governmental structures. Documents were worded so there can be flexibility in how traditional knowledge keepers develop, implement, and operate the land trust. How will it work? Generally, private landowners will donate land to the land trust. Terms of land use will be negotiated. Initially, the Land Between will assist the Land Trust Council, Land Trust Clan Council, as required to negotiate land usage terms with the owners. I understand there's a certain amount of legalities that have to be included in how land trusts run. However, I'm hoping by accessing non-governmental funding, we'll be able to have more flexibility in our operations and how our cultural revitalization is initiated. Role of the Land Between. It's an incubator. From the land trust inception, it has always been the intent to have the land trust run by elders and traditional knowledge keepers. For this reason, the land trust, the land between, has also stated its role is to incubate the land trust and set a foundation that is legally flexible within the system, but hopefully gives members the flexibility to operate as true to our original teachings as possible. For this reason, we are developing an MOU for the land between and the traditional government land trust. This will clearly set out the terms of this relationship. It is my hope that this will ensure the land trust stays as true to its original intent as possible. The legal document reaching completion. The land trust application is in the final stage of development and should be reviewed by our lawyers and our ever expanding knowledge holder working group. Hopefully by the end of this year. It says this month, but it's looking more like end of this year. Following that, we will need to have an initial plan council meeting to sign the agreement and send it off. This has been a long process, and we've had a lot of volunteers and staff working on this. And we're excited that this land trust will be one piece of the puzzle that helps our people get back to the restoration of our original spiritual, cultural, language, and traditional practices, as well as our clan governance systems. So that was originally the end of my presentation, but this morning I just thought I'd throw some other thoughts down here to end it off. I think I've got time because I haven't seen Carrie Ann come on here. And so having said all of this, only a small percentage of our people have knowledge of how the clan system works. And I'm not saying that that these are just, again, this is just my understanding today. There are people out there, they're scattered, and we're kind of working in maybe silos to some degree, but at some point, I think we're all going to come together. On that note, before I forget, there's a Securing Indigenous Land Tenure Association seminar or webinar scheduled for December 6th to 7th. So that's the SILTA meeting. So just check that out. I'll try and provide these links to the organizers so that they can be posted. So as I'm saying again, we all only know the history of when we had no other option to fight. You know, when I'm talking about our warrior spirit and I'm talking about the way we lived, there is no record of how balanced and how our system actually worked, because history began, the history that 99.9% of Canada knows started with us at war. And it there's no prelude to our history. So another thought that I had this morning is and actually there's a story behind this, but I won't get into that, is that time is not linear, it's circular. Like spirit life, it continues. And I guess too, when you're looking at the creation story, and mostly all cultures and spiritual groups have their own creation story, and a lot of it includes, and I just made these points today, and a lot of it includes breaking natural law, and then the consequences for doing so. You know, then a reflection, then a cleansing, some sort of sacrifice, and you know, then rejuvenation. So somewhere along the lines here, we're in that process right now, where you know, there's human progress and development is kind of a lot of times it goes against natural law. And another thing here that came to mind this morning is, oh yeah, and so how bad do we have to be before our creator creates balance once again? Another thought is, know the enemy, know who divides us as humans. And we as Indigenous people, this is kind of falls into the responsibilities that Chris and Danika were talking about this morning too, is we as Indigenous people, and we'll have to fight to learn what our names are. We'll have to fight to learn our languages. We'll have to fight to learn our tradition, cultures, and ceremonies. But most of these battles will happen within us. So first, we need a safe place to do this, with people who know this needs, the people that know this has to be done. So that kind of concludes my presentation today. I hope you are all there, because I haven't, it's kind of odd speaking in here, but I'm kind of used to that, Carrie Ann. So anyways, I'm done.
Awesome. Miigwech, Ger. What a great presentation. I'm very appreciative of you ensuring that our audience understands the whys before looking into your great initiative of a traditional land trust. Your initiative of the land trust, what a great look into the concept of two-eyed seeing, where a colonial structure is merged with the Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And really, I think, and as an example of that concept of an IPCA that Danika explained. So miigwech for that and all of your wisdom. Miigwech to all of our panelists. At this time, we are going to ask all our panelists to turn their cameras on to have a bit of a discussion and give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions. Reminder, if you want to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A box accessible in the bottom panel bar. And if you like a question that someone has already posed, just hit the thumbs up and it will rank those that are most popular. Before we get into the questions, though, let's see what the results of our polls were. So Mario, I'll turn it over to you for that. In what part of the province do you reside? So a majority of the people are residing in the GTA. Awesome. Tell us your affiliation. It looks like majority of the people are coming to us from conservation authorities. How familiar are you with the term IPCA? So majority of the people are somewhat, a lot of the people as well are not at all. How many federally funded IPCAs are there in Ontario? 4 are, some people say, majority of the people say 4. I'm not even really aware of that. I'm not sure if somebody else wants to pop on and maybe let us know. If not, that's something we'll have to look into. So
I
awesome.
found 4, Carrie Ann.
4?
Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. So with that, we have a couple of questions from the audience. So I am going to, it doesn't look like we have any that are directed specifically to any of our panelists. So we are going to start with this one. How do we challenge the settler concept of Georgian Bay as pristine? Well, I guess this one actually, Chris, if you want to tackle this first. So how do we challenge the settler concept of Georgian Bay as pristine and wilderness, ideally historically untouched, undeveloped by humans, which undermines kinship relationships of reciprocity? So how do we challenge the settler concept of Georgian Bay as pristine and wilderness, which undermines kinship relationships of reciprocity?
I mean, I guess it's kind of hard to challenge that concept of what is pristine now in comparison to historically. There are, you know, within Georgian Bay, there are pretty untouched lands in the sense that there's no building and stuff. So if you're just kind of talking about them kind of areas, yeah, I would say pristine. A lot of the waterways too are, in comparison to other areas within Ontario, is pretty pristine area. I don't know, I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Chris. So next question we got here is, what kind of small scale work needs to happen to see this change in thinking about caring for the land and relationships that humans have within all of creation? Garrett, did you want to take a shot at that one first?
Yeah, I think what the concept of our land trust, from my perspective, is that it's not so much the acquiring of the land. That is very, very important, but you know, it's the act of people recognizing the purpose of what we're doing, and the purpose of what we're doing is to give our knowledge keepers and elders a place where we can actually practice our language, practice our sense of our clan system governance. And that clan system of governance naturally recognizes the environment. And I think the more that we learn about our clan system government and how that connects us to the land and the importance of respecting that land, and the more we can share that with the mainstream, and the more that will naturally protect and demonstrate the power and the purity of interacting with our environment and the people that coexist with us in that environment.
Thanks, Garrett. Danika, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Just on the first couple of questions from Clara, I think part of the challenge that we are facing collectively is that we need to shift the kind of values that we attribute to the natural world. And so in terms of the way sort of mainstream or dominant systems have developed, it's been to look at the environment as whether it has utility for human beings. So, you know, whether we can benefit from it through capitalism, through development, et cetera, or through settlement. So I think part of what you've hit on there when you talk about settler colonialism is that when people look at Georgian Bay, they are not going to look at the cottagers and say, are the cottagers infringing on the pristine environment of Georgian Bay? They're not going to look at the recreational vehicle users and say, are they infringing on the pristine nature of Georgian Bay? Because those things benefit people who have sort of elevated or privileged rights within the context of the dominant system. And I think the reason that that kind of question comes up when it comes to Indigenous peoples is I think it kind of comes up because there's a sort of a fear that some of the land that has been settled and people have had fee simple title through owning homes, owning land, et cetera, that there's this generalized fear of what this potentially means for their holdings in a sense. And so I think part of what we need to do is to sort of go through a relationship building exercise to try to develop and strengthen relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And I thought that Chris's presentation was a fantastic example of that, of a First Nation working with, for example, a biosphere area governance and municipalities in the province and stuff. Those are things that I think need to happen more at that sort of small scale of developing relationships. And then also sort of understanding that some of the way that we value the natural environment is actually stuff that we've sort of been taught either in mass media or even in our education, whether that's primary, secondary, or post-secondary, about what the value of the environment really is. And so there's a sense like there's no value to land unless it can be developed, unless it can provide some type of monetary benefit. But I think what we're seeing, for example, in the example of BC, you know, there was value to the trees insofar as they could be part of forestry, but there was no sort of thinking about what the value of the trees was in terms of retaining intact ecosystems and making sure that the land around things like roads remained stable. And so I think like shifting how we value the natural environment is a really big part of that. And creating sort of a new ethical approach to the environment, I think, is really important. And so in years past, people have tried to do this in the context of sort of capitalism, and they've tried to attribute monetary value to land. So they'll say, okay, so if we don't log this area that's known to be a watershed, you know, then what's the value of that for us financially? And so some people said, well, there is a value. It's called ecosystem services. So saying that we're not going to touch that to let it exist, to let it continue to do its job in the natural scheme of things, they'll say, well, if we log that, how much would it cost to replace that with hard infrastructure? That's how they tried to create new value for watersheds, for example, to protect watersheds. So that's been happening for a long time. But I think what we're hearing in terms of the context of IPCAs is that we don't actually want to stay in the lane of the dominant system and how it sees the natural environment. IPCAs are about bringing different values and ethics and how we think about our relationality to the natural world. So it's not so predicated on consumerism or consumption or financial benefits or economic growth, that it's actually predicated on relationality, having good relations with the lands and territories around us, and enacting good relations through systems that understand how to live in balance with those things. And I think that generally people in society are hungry for that, especially in the face of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I hope that, for me, that's really what clicked, Clara, with your excellent question. Thank you so much for posing that.
Awesome. Thanks, Danika. There's a question here that I got from Gary. Gary, I'm wondering about land trusts and traditional uses on the land. I work on a land trust area and they've got very tight rules around no harvest, no bringing in or taking out, etc. Is that something that's going to be a challenge at all?
I think that I think there's going to be a lot of unforeseen challenges. However, I guess if we're looking at traditional rights that we have in any area where an individual landowner is willing to donate land, I think you have to look at the traditional rights that people have within that area, and the negotiation of how the land use goes with the landowners. I know, just thinking off the top of my head, I remember back in the day when Curve Lake was as part of the Williams Treaty were the only what was one of 7 communities that didn't have any hunting fishing rights in Canada. When we got an agreement with the province that we could hunt with a letter from a landowner, and I think that's how we look at harvesting issues. Or I mean, that's literally how we dealt with harvesting issues. When we needed a letter from the landowner so that we could hunt on the land if it or hunt on provincial or federal property. So there's certainly going to be obstacles as far as hunting and fishing or traditional use, but hopefully there's flexibility with how those things happen, because it's all a relearning and integral part of exercising those traditional principles and traditional teachings. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Gare. Did Danika or Chris want to add anything to that one? No, I got one here for you, Chris. Curious how overlapping community use of land and ongoing land claim negotiations are considered when establishing a new IPCA.
The way they're considered is obviously for Shawanaga Island, we had to look at private lands that already exist on the island and surrounding islands and exclude them. I mean, they are already private. That opens up a whole nother can of worms if you're going to try bringing in like people's private land into an IPCA. So we established more of like a jurisdictional boundary excluding them and worked with that. So it's kind of like how we had to navigate it. Yeah, so.
Danika, did you want to add to that one?
No, that's okay.
Okay, I've got another one here is, how is land ownership dealt with when setting up IPCAs? You want to tackle that one?
Sure, yeah. So IPCAs are not intended to be a form of land tenure. They're intended to be a mechanism through which land or waters receive a designation of an element of protection or conservation. And that protection and conservation is governed, as I mentioned, using whatever model is chosen by the folks who choose to create that designation. It doesn't mean that that the land becomes Indigenous land at all. It's not intended to be a form of land tenure at all. And so, for example, you could see like an IPCA being developed within a national park, like Banff National Park could develop an IPCA within its boundaries that could be Indigenous led. That would be maybe a designation of a very special place within the park for a particular Indigenous nation, for example. And certainly, you know, you could collaborate with private landowners to co-create an IPCA as well that could encompass private land. That's something that could definitely be negotiated, but it would not change the tenure of that private landowner. Like IPCAs can't alter fee simple title. They have there's no capacity for that. So it's similar to other conservation measures that exist in various provinces and territories across the country. Some of these do overlap with federal crown land, or they could be provincial territorial land, but they don't fundamentally change legal title within the context of common law, or in Quebec in the context of civil law. So hope that clarifies things.
Thanks, Danika. Here's another one for you. I was wondering if you could perhaps comment on your experience in bringing the concept of ethical space to the We Rise Together report, and how it has been carried forward since then in the context of IPCA development.
Sure. Yeah, this is a really big question. For sure. I can try to find a great picture to try to show you guys. But essentially what ethical space is it's intended to be sort of a transformative approach to relationship building between Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous peoples, and the natural world. And so when we did the We Rise Together work as the Indigenous Circle of Experts, what happened was that we decided to adopt this ethical space approach in the context of our work as a committee. And in the context, actually, it was adopted by the Whole Pathway Initiative. The Whole Pathway Initiative adopted the ethical space approach. And so, so part of the beauty of the ethical space approach is that it's actually not something that came from Indigenous peoples. It was adapted by a Cree scholar named Willie Ermine back in the early 2000s. He was looking at actually an ethical space paper that was done in 1969 by sort of a pop philosopher. I don't know if they were Canadian or American. So he took this idea of how do we create ethical relations between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in a way that gets us out of what I would call like our default approaches to each other, which is either negotiation or the courts, it seems, historically anyway. And how do we do that in honoring things like treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements? How do we honor emerging standards that we might see in the context of you know, of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the TRC calls to action, or as our last speaker was so eloquently referring to, which was the RCAP report. And so if you don't mind, I'm just going to share quickly the page from the We Rise Together report that addresses ethical space. So the idea is that when we elevate Indigenous systems and they're considered working in parallel with non-Indigenous systems, how do we ensure that those Indigenous systems are allowed to function without any disruption from the non-Indigenous systems? And so the idea is that these systems are honored to be fully functional on their own, but that the space that we create between them is the place where we engage with one another, and that space is framed by these emerging and existing standards that are important to us, like the treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements, like the historic treaties in Canada, or the newer self-government agreements, etc. And then also the TRC calls to action, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples final report, and now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, not only the international standards, but also how they're being implemented in Canada. And finally, just our Canadian Constitution and our Canadian jurisprudence. So all of these things sort of reframe relationality between and amongst all of us, so that when we do engage, we're bringing our outcomes from our separate systems through this lens of this new framework of these emerging and existing standards. And we're engaging in dialogue and cross-validating what makes sense for us in terms of thinking about how to create better relationships. And that makes it more ethical, because we're not getting bogged down in years of litigation or years of negotiation, that we're able to take these ideas, this new framing, and create something really transformative and innovative in the way that we build relationships with one another. This is quite different from two-eyed seeing, which was something that was created and articulated by Elder Albert Marshall and others, and which I actually don't know enough about to really speak to very well. I think Gary would, but so these are different concepts, but they're sort of similar approaches in that they're both, I think, intended to reconfigure relationality.
Thank you, Danika, for that. I love that concept of again, bringing both worlds together in a space to going back to our governance structures around everything being equal and really building off each other's knowledge. Another question here. Can you comment on how Anishinaabe culture and health is linked to the land in its natural form? And I'm going to throw that one over to you, Gary.
Okay. I just, again, I'm just going to say from my experience, what comes to mind initially on that is in the early to mid 1960s, there was I believe a professor or researcher that came to Curve Lake, and he interviewed, I'm going to say 20 elders from our community here. And at that time, our population may have been 300 people total. And out of those 300 people, there was 20 elders that he interviewed. Let's say, I actually forget the number. I did have the tapes at one time, but they went back to the cultural center here. But my point is, okay, so we had 20 elders that were recorded out of a population of 300. Today, we may have 20 elders, but our population now is pushing 2,000, if not more. So the correlation between health and the Western life and our extraction from our original way of life has not done us any favors as far as longevity goes or health goes. Access to land means access to our traditional medicines, access to our traditional foods, which means improved health. So if you just look at the one fact alone is that our health suffers, our longevity suffers because of the restricted access to our traditional lands. And if you look at that Turtle Island that has no boundaries on it, Canada's square mile is something like 9.9, almost 10,000 square kilometers, if not more. If I'm reading it wrong, it's huge. And the Indigenous, our people only occupy less than 2% of that. So there's an imbalance there, and I think, or at least I hope I've answered the questions as quickly as I could.
Awesome. No, thanks, Gary. Chris or Danika, did you want to add to that question before we get into our last question? So this will be our last questions for this session, and it's for anyone still wondering how IPCAs are being negotiated between Indigenous communities with overlapping traditional territory, ongoing land claim negotiations. Did you want to take a crack at that one first, Danika?
Yeah, so basically this is not a designation that is intended to amplify conflict. So let's start there. IPCAs are not being used to amplify conflict between different kinds of parties. And in fact, IPCAs are negotiated in the way that the parties to them decide that they will be negotiated. So some folks are employing ethical space in their approaches, others are not. And so there's no one size fits all kind of thing that's going on here. So contrary to sort of, I think, the premise of the question, which is this idea that this is being applied everywhere somehow, this is actually IPCAs and their negotiation and their proliferation is highly dependent on the people in those places where they are being, where they become ideas and get legs and get funding and start. And so as Chris gave you a great example of how they did theirs, that is not the template for how everybody does their IPCA. It's just one example of how an IPCA can happen. And so as I mentioned, like, they don't change land tenure. They are not intended to replace consultation or accommodation. That's a very important point to make. IPCAs are not intended to replace the need for consultation or accommodation on a particular developed area or proposed development. And IPCAs are not intended to replace any claim negotiations that are ongoing. They can certainly, up to the parties, if they want to introduce this concept into their negotiations as an outcome of those negotiations. But honestly, like, I have no idea what's happening in the country right now. I saw some questions about like geographically specific questions. I don't know. I am not sort of the information clearinghouse about IPCAs and what's all happening across the country. And unfortunately, you know, I saw one of the questions like, are there other Indigenous organizations doing this besides the Indigenous Circle of Experts? Well, actually, the Indigenous Circle of Experts only existed for the duration of the Pathway Initiative. And when we handed in our report in 2018, the ICE ceased to exist, right? So there's no sort of, to my knowledge, there's been no like sort of replacement organization or entity that's been created. This is generally being discussed at the federal government, that there's a possibility that like another ICE could be appointed somehow. But as far as I know, that hasn't happened. I could be misinformed. I don't know. Maybe somebody else here knows that there's another ICE that's being formed. But as far as I know, there isn't. And as far as I know, there also isn't sort of a national organization on Indigenous-led conservation. So, so to your question, I think it was Kauthar Shash. So the kinds of organizations that exist right now, there are lots of Indigenous organizations in Canada. There's national representative organizations like the Assembly of First Nations. There's PTOs, provincial territorial organizations like the Chiefs of Ontario, COO. And there's other organizations that are sort of specific to different kinds of mandates, like Indigenous Climate Action, which is specifically Indigenous peoples working on climate change issues. But as far as I know, there's no sort of like Indigenous-run, Indigenous-led organization on conservation or protected areas. So this is also reflective, I think, of the fact that a lot of this work has to happen nation by nation, right? So Chris gave you the example of his nation doing an IPCA. There's a reason that works, is because it's specific to the nation that is being engaged, specific to their history, specific to their needs, to their aspirations, to what they want to do. If you try to take an approach that like encompasses like, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of First Nations or Métis settlements or Inuit peoples, and try to shove them all into one category, it's going to be highly problematic because there's so much diversity and there's so many different experiences. And even as we know, everybody on this circle today that has gathered knows that there's incredible diversity of ecosystems across the country. And so there's no sort of one size fits all template. That's why I was mentioning in my presentation, it's about elements. It's about enlivening Indigenous systems so that they can start to inform what could be sort of the content of IPCAs and how they work between, say, overlapping territories. That's up to people who are the inhabitants of those territories, and not so much like a top-down approach where we say, well, this is what happens when territories overlap. We're saying, no, let's empower those Indigenous peoples to be the experts to tell us, here's what's happening when the territories overlap. So I hope that helps.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Danika. So I would like to again say miigwech to all our speakers, Danika, Chris, and Gary. The wisdom, knowledge, and insight that you've provided today has, I'm sure, helped our audience understand the concept of IPCAs and the many forms that they can take, as well as the importance of ensuring that spaces and opportunities are created for implementation. I would also like to say miigwech to the Latornell Steering Committee members that helped make this webinar happen, including Jamie Jordy, Nikisha Mohammed, Barb Mackenzie Winya, Nicholas Burnett, Mario Millet, and Karen Anderson. The Latornell Conservation Symposium is on hiatus as we reimagine our way of connecting with you in this new normal. I'm proud and honored to have a place serving on this committee, and I'm impressed with how positive and supportive the committee has been. A committee has been to ensure to make space and have meaningful inclusion of Indigenous voices as we navigate a world that is at a tipping point in which we all must work together to ensure we leave a healthy and vibrant place for our next 7 generations. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Latornell Symposium website for anyone to watch. Give us a couple of days to get it posted. As well, we're back on the 24th with our next webinar, which is going to talk about ecological monitoring tools. And one more thing for you to do before you leave, please complete our last poll on the screen telling us how informative you felt this webinar was. Miigwech again for taking the time to learn more about Indigenous protected and conserved areas. What does that mean and what could that look like? Stay safe. Bamapi.